Ladies and gentlemen, now I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Emanuel Pastreich, Professor Kyung University. And before we begin, I would like to introduce briefly, him briefly. Professor Emanuel Pastreich has been a professor at Kyung University since 2011. And he is an affiliate at the Council on East Asian Studies at Yale University. Professor Pastreich is also a director and a founder of the Asia Institute, which is a research institute for the study of technology's impact on society and promoting international collaboration on technology and society throughout Asia. Here is PhD at Harvard University in East Asian Languages and Civilization, and Master at University of Tokyo in Comparative Literature, and BA at Yale University in Chinese Literature. He published numerous books, including The Distant Mirror for the Close at Hand, Chinese Vernacular, novels in Joseon, Korea, first coming 2015, 한국인만 모르는 다른 대한민국, 2013, 세계 석학들, 한국 미래를 말하다, 2012, 하버드 박사의 한국 표일기, 2011, and innumerable publications, including books, book chapters, articles on literature, and uncountable presentations and talks. So I believe we are here for a real treat tonight. Please welcome Dr. Emanuel Pastreich with a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Professor Lee, for your very kind words. It's a great honor to be here with everyone this evening and to have a chance to talk about the city of Seoul. As President Lee mentioned a moment ago, we want to start up by giving a little bit of background about King Sejong, because he was the figure, in a way, who gave the great cultural impetus for what Seoul would become. So I have the short. The video is presented by Korean Spirit and Culture Promotion Project, which has put together a variety of these short videos introducing Korean culture, which I found extremely helpful. Start.
Hangul, alphabet of compassion, invented 550 years ago. Of the 6,000 languages spoken around the world, only 1% have their own writing. The Chepang tribe from Nepal, who are without an alphabet of their own, have adopted the Korean letters Hangul in an effort to preserve their language and culture. Over in Indonesia, it's a similar story with the indigenous Societas tribe. Although Hangul was never intended for their language, it replicates it perfectly, as its 24 letters are able to express over 11,000 sounds, by far the most in the world.
그리고 누리글 없으면 체팡말 없어져 버릴 수도 있어요.
Completed in 1443, it is the last alphabet created in history, and the only alphabet made by man where the linguistic theories, motivation, date of invention and inventor have been perfectly documented. This is a tale of Hangul and its pioneer, King Sejong the Great. Consonants. King Sejong completes the consonants after 10 years of extensive research, including a study of the human anatomy. Alphabets began as pictographs, as a representation of everyday objects, but these new letters were iconically modelled after the human speech organs. Gu, the sound of letter G. As we make that sound, note how the base of the tongue blocks the throat. That is what the Korean G looks like. Nu, This is the sound of letter N. The tip of our tongue is raised towards our upper teeth, and hence the shape of the Korean N. Mu. The sound of letter M in English. The Korean M is modelled after our mouth as we make the sound. Su. The sound S. This range of sound relies heavily on our dental organs. Accordingly, it is shaped like our interlocking teeth. U. Our throat opens up, and the Korean O takes the shape of the throat. These are the
Okay, so that's the introduction to King Sejong, who played such an enormous role in establishing Seoul as a major cultural center. And now I will continue with my presentation. So I said Tale of Two Cities, and I'm thinking in general terms about what we tend to call Gangnam, now globally famous, and the Gangbuk, the culture of the northern side where you happen to be at this moment. I think if you see, as you'll see in the course of the presentation, the relationship is a little bit more complex than that. What I would suggest is that the interplay, the tension between these two sort of cultures within the city, or these two simultaneously coexisting cities, two cultures, is what gives Seoul its tremendous cultural power. It's not that the buildings are more beautiful necessarily in Seoul than in other cities, or that all the amenities are perfect, but there's a certain sort of vitality about the city of Seoul which keeps people here, myself included. And I would say I'm in a way representative, and my field is not Korea at all. I started in Chinese studies. I taught Japanese studies for 10 years in the United States, and I lived in Japan an equal amount of time to Korea. But I found in this city a remarkable sort of an energy. So we'll start from the beginning, from the founding of the Chosun and the establishment of the city of Seoul back in the 14th century. The two cultures in competition can be traced back to that beginning. The two major figures behind that, with their slightly different views of what this new capital could be, and it really was a new capital then, have come down to the present. So we can trace things back, not to the last 50 years, for the last 500-600 years. The monk, so for the founder of the Chosun dynasty, the general Lee Seung-gae, he had two advisors. We had lots of advisors, but two main figures who were involved in the process of planning the city of Seoul. The first was Muhak, who, as you can see, is a Buddhist monk, also very knowledgeable in geomancy, pungsu, or feng shui in Chinese, and who mapped out and planned for the city along his own sense of this harmony between humans and nature, and essentially a Buddhist, Taoist cosmology. On the other hand, Jung Do-jan was a major advisor to the founder as well, Lee Seung-gae, Taejo, the king, and he came from a very different background. As you can see from the picture, he's a Confucian scholar, not only a Confucian scholar, but a rather rigid Confucian scholar. He wrote a famous book attacking Buddhism, and he had a vision of the city of Seoul as representing, in the great sort of Neo-Confucian tradition of Jushi, a sort of a perfection of principles, perfection of principle in the world of man, in which things would be laid down along at right angles. There would be major boulevards. Things would be planned out in a sort of a representation of these underlying basic principles. Whereas Muhak, in his original plan, I think, saw a city more in an organic alignment with the surrounding countryside. They picked different mountains for the basis of their view. Muhak started with Inwangsan, which you're probably familiar with, and imagine the palace sort of at the beginning of the Chosun being organically combined with that mountain, and Cheongdojeon picked Pukangsan, which is a very also they're both impressive mountains, but is in a way more of a signature of sort of royal authority and the state, in which the palace was built underneath it, essentially on a north-south with a north-south axis. What's now Cheongno, the road, the boulevard below it, so that the sort of the authority of the mountain and all its chi, its energy, would be channeled through the king in the palace and then spread out to the country below, very much reinforcing the official authority of the king through these choices. So they had different views. And I would say, in a general way, that these two different cities of Seoul started then, and they have always existed together since. Although the nature of the tensions and circularity has shifted. So in the old days, well, first there's a major river. So there are two major rivers in the city of Seoul. The first is Cheonggyecheon, which is, of course, goes through the middle of Gwanghwamun, not too far away from here. And that was the main sort of north-south division in the Chosun period, right? So if you said Gangnam, Gangbuk, in a sense, at that time it was the northern village and the southern village, then that was along that smaller river, right? And the Hangang, the larger river, was much, much later did Seoul actually expand down to that river. And only in the 1970s did it really jump over that river and start to expand further south. So the idea of the north and the south of the river, it was two different rivers, obviously. And in the old days, the North Village was a prestigious area. People who came to serve in government and established bureaucrats were there. Some of them managed to stay on for many generations, but in general, in fact, people tended to have their own base, right, their own academy or their own town, and they would live in the northern village only while they were serving and then return. And the southern village had a more diverse group of population, including many of what was sort of the middle, what they call middle class, not really the Chungin, middle people. That was essentially people with special skills, right? Architects, people, also translators and others, scientists. Okay. And then, of course, the original plan, this is looking down from the Gyeongbokgung Palace. I took a picture of this in the Seoul Museum, the Seoul City Museum, not far from here, which I have spent many hours enjoying. And there were six ministries on either side now, where you see the American Embassy, which is now getting to be the oldest building in Seoul. It was sort of lined essentially along Cheongdojeon's vision, very, very schematic. There's a map of the north side of town there with Gyeongbokgung. There's the palace here, the Cheonggyecheon running down below, Cheongdokgung, the later palace here, and this is where the sort of elite part of Seoul lived. Later on, of course, Seoul is an old city. Some people tend to think, and I did when I first came here to visit, it was an entirely new city, right? I had been living in Taipei when I was undergraduate, and Seoul had just sprouted up in the last 20 years. But in fact, it's one of the oldest cities around in many respects, although it has been so restructured that sometimes it's obscured. So King Yeongjo in the is this not working? Or you want to free me? King Yeongjo, stepping out, in the 18th century, as of course the great tragedy of the Chosun period was his conflict with his son, right, Sado Seja. And this conflict had multiple facets to it. But one of them, which I find interesting, and I'd like to mention, is the degree to which his son became very interested in a sort of the other culture of Seoul, right? So they got into this sort of like tremendous political fight, which actually ended in a tremendous crisis for the country, and the famous or infamous decision to put his son into a rice box where he died. But his son would escape from the palace and go out into the city and meet all sorts of people from sort of the back alleys of Seoul, and became fascinated with that other culture, this other Seoul. And this story I found always quite compelling. In fact, I've wanted to write about it from a long time ago. Maybe the most representative of that, this is already from the 18th century. We see this 18th century is when Seoul starts to become a more substantial city, right? Has a more of of course, a long tradition, but a more diverse economy, and it starts to become more commercial. You start to get things like printing houses and people selling antiques, and sort of a more complex economic system. So at that time, if this is Jongno going up to the palace, you have what's called the Pimakol, which was this back street. I was able to find some on the internet, where people would go to drink makgeolli, to enjoy themselves, and to live in that other city of Seoul. Pimakol, as you know, was still quite active until relatively recently. Only in the last 15 years has it essentially been. If you go to the Museum of Seoul history, it includes little pieces of Pimakol that they saved to this back alley. And there is about a half a block which is preserved, but basically it's disappeared. So even from the 18th century, this was very much a part of Seoul culture. Later on, there's a whole, I can only give you history very briefly, but there was Emperor Kojong. Seoul went up and down in its fortunes in the 19th century, and he set out to try and rebuild Seoul and make it into something glorious again, including rebuilding the Kyung Palace, which had been burned down by the Japanese and had been left essentially a park after that, and trying to make Seoul into what he imagined to be an international capital that would be set Korea's stature in Asia. He built the first Western-style tea house, where he would sit all his days talking to diplomats from various countries, trying to figure out a way for Korea to survive as an independent country. And in his Doksungun Palace, it was this amazing combination of sort of Western and traditional. Not all these structures are his creations, but mixed together Western and Eastern culture as well. And then Japan occupied and tried to remake Seoul for a long period of time, right? From basically starting from the beginning of the 20th century until 1945. And there were some very specific cultural implications of that. Maybe the most significant was that Seoul was made into a playground. Maybe that's too strong a word, but the places which had originally been centers for governance, for serious issues, for scholarship, were made into places where you could go and take a nice walk, enjoy the scenes, and the whole city itself was made into sort of a playground-like environment. Many Japanese loved to go to the city of Seoul to enjoy the sights and sort of hang out. Many people enjoyed coming and living in Seoul for that very reason, but it lost much of the seriousness, the sort of gravitas as a capital. Among the decisions made were that to make the governor's house here, essentially right in front of the Gyeongbokgung, blocking off the flow of the chi from the mountain down to the city and asserting Japan's position. And then, by the way, this building has disappeared in the last 20 years, 15 years. And then City Hall, which still survives, also part of that colonial period. And now part of a very complex, in what I'd say, the perfect representation of the two cities, right? You have the old city, not necessarily colonial per se, but of a different scale and a different structure, including in the basement the Citizens Hall, the Shimincheong, which is a sort of unique space for people to for performances and for markets. And then you have the sort of like very ultra-modern, sleek structure of the future, combined together in the City Hall itself. Under Japanese rule also, north and south, the Namcheon, Bukchon, were reversed, right? Whereas the northern side was a place of great status previously, now the southern side was a place that the Japanese developed, things like the Chosun Hotel, and then beyond it to try and make it into a sort of a very modern, they're trying to sort of sell this image of a modern Seoul at the time. So the north-south relationship, Gangbuk, Gangnam, of course now talking about Cheonggyecheon, was intentionally reversed by the Japanese. Again, making it into sort of a place, this is 1929, I believe, the map that was distributed, sort of like a World's Fair enjoying Seoul. In the Korean War, of course, Seoul suffered an enormous amount of damage. It also was occupied by both sides repeatedly, first by the Republic of Korea, then by North Korea, then the Republic of Korea, then North Korea, then the Republic of Korea again. This caused an enormous amount of cultural, political chaos, and also an enormous amount of damage to the city itself. In the post-war period, the Cheonggyecheon, for example, was the site of these housing that sort of were sprung up almost spontaneously as people looked for housing. Of course, the city had been destroyed. Much had to be put together very quickly. These buildings, there's a recreation in front of there's a museum, the Cheonggyecheon Exhibition Hall near Wangchingli, and they recreated two of these buildings, not the originals, but in the same structure, so you can see how they were. But this was what Seoul looked like, and although it looks maybe sort of quaint to us, for Koreans, it was a representation of the chaos, the lack of consistency, and the poverty that Korea had suffered through. So in the period after this, in the 1960s, the highest priority for many Koreans, for many Seoulites, was to move beyond this image of Seoul. So maybe the most representative of that new Seoul, this effort to totally recreate Seoul. Of course, Seoul was a city which had been totally created from nothing once before, but to recreate it was the mayor Kim Hyun-oh. Sorry, you didn't capitalize it. And in his period, his administration from 1966 went through a very thoroughgoing effort to modernize the city, to tear down large areas which had been inhabited in these sort of helter-skelter, hugger-mugger residences. Much of the city was low, one-floor, one-story buildings, many with thatched roofs. That was true, in the 18th and 19th century. So, although Seoul was a very old city, the idea of Seoul as a multi-floored, concrete, brick, steel houses is something that was really, really quite recent. And under Mayor Kim, there were enormous efforts to totally remake the city. One of them was the total restructuring of the Cheonggyecheon itself, which at the time was seen as an enormous step forward, right? Because, of course, we got rid of all this broken down houses, but of course the stream itself was running underground with a freeway over it. And this was actually what it looked like when I first came to visit Korea back in '91. And then beyond that, Seoul spread south. So now the north-south division is not around Cheonggyecheon, but along the Gangnam Hangang River, the Han River. And as Seoul moved down, we get things like the Hyundai apartments, this new concept of what apartments could be. This doesn't look new at all. This is like what everything looks like now, but at the time was a radical shift, both in terms of how you live and how you planned the city. Also, Seoul National University was moved to Kwanat Mountain, that area in Gangnam in this period as well, for a variety of reasons, part of the expansion, this new vision for Gangnam, but also, of course, related to the various political turmoil at the time, in which there were many demonstrations in the campus of Seoul, which used to be in the Haewon-dong, right, up where Seoul National University Hospital still is. And then, of course, there were enormous amounts of demonstrations back in the 1980s in the democracy movement. Seoul is a place where people come together. I was just down at DDP today, the new culture center there, and I learned that they'd had enormous masses of people when they had an exhibition of Pokemon characters recently. So you have still this tendency of Koreans to come together as they did, say, the 2002 World Cup or Pokemon a couple weeks ago, and it's very much a part of the culture of Seoul, this sort of getting together in large groups. The 1988 Olympics, another defining moment for Korea. We mentioned the mayor, Kim Hyun-ok, and his development. It really was what led up to the 1988 Olympics, which was seen as the moment which Korea would go to being an international sort of recognized country and get out of the shadow of both the Japanese colonial occupation and the American sort of aid-driven development of the 50s and 60s. And that involved these enormous buildings, enormous structures, big freeways, and a very, very different Seoul indeed from what it had been before. The World Cup I mentioned a moment ago. So then the last three mayors have been very, very much interested in the city of Seoul and sort of leaving their mark, but in very different ways. Mayor Emanuel Pastreich was a central figure in finally driving through the plans to reopen Cheonggyecheon as a river and to make it a center for a more sort of ecological city. Here he is at the opening of the start of Cheonggyecheon and this new space which allowed for sort of like a new introduction of nature into the city. Cheonggyecheon itself, since 2005, has been evolving, right? When it opened, it had relatively little green. Most of it looked like this. And now, if you go there today, there are a lot of native fish there. It has become sort of an ecosystem. And after the first block and a half, it's essentially plants and it's very close to a natural environment. So it's really growing. And very many people I hear now, people come to the city of Seoul from other countries, they look at Cheonggyecheon as sort of like a model for how to bring nature back into the heart of a major city. In fact, Korea is one of the only places I think that Seoul has been really successful in that respect. Mayor Oh Se-hun, the next mayor, was very interested in making Korea a center for design and sort of a creative. He started this idea of creative economy in some respects as a keyword. And his great project was the DDP, this enormous, multifaceted space with Zaha Hadid, who did this enormous, I don't know what you call it. Some people call it the UFO, a very organic, modern space, unlike anything in Seoul, and in some respects, a remarkable structure, right? It's a sort of a product of an enormous discussion between very creative Western trained architects and the Samsung Construction, who are trying to put together this sort of international collaboration, really unprecedented in Korean history. In any case, the idea was fashion, design, and sort of a creative new economy for Korea. And then the present mayor, Park Won-sung, who's somewhat different than many politicians in that he was originally really an NGO person, not really a politician per se. And one of his sort of markers, I would say, is the Citizens Hall, the Shimincheong, in the basement of City Hall, which is this enormous space in which citizens can create their own sort of events. People can sell their products, and a combination of citizens groups, artists, musicians have come together to create a very, very vital space in which everybody can be a part. So I split it into Gangnam and Ganggu. Gangnam represents, starting from the 1970s, but really took off in the 1980s, this vision of a modern Korea, extremely, very westernized, a place where you can drive your car, right? Many people drive cars in Gangnam, although it's getting harder. A lot of traffic, very sort of brash, slightly impulsive, very creative in its own way, turning its back largely on the Korean past, something in which you can start things from scratch. And of course, Gangnam is full of restaurants, which have only been around for a couple weeks, right? And stores keep going up. As you know, it's constantly being built. New structures are going up. Even structures that are not that old are being replaced by new ones. So it's a very dynamic space. Probably the most happening place in Gangnam is Gil, this road which has become a sort of the fashion center of Korea. All sorts of remarkable cafes, stores have sprung up along this space. And it's a very amusing place as well. It's a little bit like Harajuku in Tokyo, but I would say it's actually, I think, more creative than Harajuku. It has, the stores are more distinctive, and you can see a lot of sort of different conflicting visions among different Koreans about what Harajuku might be. It creates sort of a dynamic there. Rodeo Drive, you're probably familiar with, where people go to hang out and drive their big cars. And then, of course, in terms of music, of course, Gangnam went global, right, with the singer Psy's hit Gangnam Style. And he, of course, did these enormous concerts, this 2012 Seoul Plaza concert, in which he brought together some 80,000 people who sang along with his songs and created a sort of very vibrant space. And really, we're talking about communities. Koreans, for whatever you may think about Seoul, it is very much about communities, different concepts of communities. And that really, I think, has driven these two cities, maybe more than two cities, 3 or 4 cities in their evolution. In the case of music, I'll first qualify everything I say by saying that I'm not an expert in K-pop or popular Korean music. I'm desperately studying this to learn about it, but it was brand new. Ask my daughter, she knows much more than I do. But what we find when we look into the music world in Korea is that it really has evolved into these communities as well. That the major sort of brands, the major corporations, SM, YG, JYP, have themselves formed into these terms, right? The SM Town, YG Family, JYP Nation. And they have compete with each other to create this sort of own communities for music. Also, the world of performance and music has become a whole structure in itself, including the emergence of academies, this Joy Dance Academy, in which you can, from a young age, be trained in how to become an idol singer. So it's a evolving and very vital culture in itself, and that really is a Gangnam. On the other side, if you go to the Hongdae area around Hongik University, you have, of course, a whole variety of other bands and alternative music in their own right. Drum, which I have only walked by. I've never actually been to an event there, but back from the 1980s, it was a major center for these punk bands, indie bands, and a whole sort of other world of music, parallel to, but quite different in its values and its priorities from K-pop. Find the Spot, No Brain X, Crying Nut. Find the Spot I did a whole interview with and had a chance to learn a little bit about their music. Very, very harsh, very spontaneous, very critical in terms of social criticism and political criticism, forming another Seoul, as it were. Seoul is originally surrounded by a fortress wall. Originally it was made of dirt, and then it was redone in stone several times. It was torn down, large parts of it, in the colonial period as part of Japan's effort to remake the city of Seoul. And in recent years, it's been refurbished and repaired, and we're getting more and more of the city, the city walls coming back. In fact, there's now a tour offered by the city of Seoul of the city walls, so you can get a stamp at each one of the gates, right, of the city. The Dongdaemun, of course, Namdaemun being the two major gates with the major markets from the Chosun period. My neighborhood, gives you an interesting idea of how this is working today. So Gwangimun, which is about 10 minutes from my house, has been redesigned and refurbished, now quite attractive, part of the city, where it looked very dilapidated before. And next to it, we have this center for Majo and Sadie. I don't know if you're familiar with Majo and Sadie. It's very popular comic books. My kids have read all. There are only, I think, 3 volumes out so far. Originally webtoon, and the artist in Majo and Sadie has created sort of Majo and Sadie world there in this cafe right next to it. Also, there's an enormous amount of musicals in Kyung. It's driven very much by these large-scale musicals, as well as other forms of independent music as well. So Cheonggyecheon I mentioned a moment ago. Specifically, if we look at it, as you can see, some parts really have become very much a regional ecosystem. It's very, very popular for people walking around, not only tourists, but Koreans who love to come out and walk the whole length or bike in certain places on the top. It also has things like a smartphone charging station, all sorts of interesting cultural artifacts. At Gwangyo Bridge, which originally was an area where artists had gathered from the Chosun period. They put together a sort of exhibition hall for a gallery for art as well. I can't really fully go through Cheonggyecheon, but it really is a fascinating place to walk. At the top, right up there in Parliament, is an area for various different social activities and protests from a long time ago. Of course, the Seoul ferry led to a series of memorials, events, and protests, and now has become actually sort of like a permanent exhibition there, if you've ever had a chance to see, little sort of structures and statues and pavilions. A lot of students gather here at the top of Cheonggyecheon for their protests, labor protests, and at the same time, festivals, the High Seoul Festival, world music, Chuseok, other sorts of festivals and activities, markets take place there as well. In the middle of Cheonggyecheon, we have in the Ujiro Saga area and with the Seoul commercial complex, very fascinating area to walk around. Older buildings, much of it manufacturing, small manufacturing and small factories producing either textiles or metal objects, etc. Seoul, one of the things which I think makes Seoul such a remarkable city is the degree to which small manufacturing has survived and continues to be a large part of the economy. So it keeps it sort of like in a sort of a vital economy, right? That's supported by manufacturing at certain levels, even in the center of the city. Also, if you go into some of these smaller manufacturing places in the area midstream, midway down, not midstream, not the very word, down the Cheonggyecheon, you find that they work together with artists to produce works of metal and plastic, right? So many of these smaller companies have actually started to work together very closely with the students from graduate school and art and artists who are active in Seoul. And that's part of a larger trend, which is unusual in cities, to see the sort of interaction between small, medium firms and artists that I will get back to as well. In the Seoul complex, it's very interesting. They created sort of like this, grass in front of this, and they put this sort of facade, sort of Potemkin facade on the front of it. But it's actually a somewhat run down, but actually quite an exciting place that I really have enjoyed walking through. Lots of very small factories there. Reminds me a bit of, well, it's very much like it was, in the 1970s, and it's continued in that economic structure. Of course, Cheonggyecheon was complex in terms of its implications. There were a lot of stores that sold shoes and garments in the area who lost their places as a result of the redevelopment. On the one hand, there's been an extremely successful effort by some of those merchants to create the Dongyo flea market, which has been very popular. On the other hand, there were large numbers who were relocated, found a new place in Changji. Changji, probably you've never been there. I hadn't even heard of it before I started. But there's a place called Garden 5, a large department store development, and they have sort of laid out their goods, but they have very few customers. And as I learned, if you want to go there and buy shoes, often they just have like a little box there telling you, tell us what you want, leave the money, and take the shoes. So it's had a complex impact, in fact, on the economy. Below it, Cheonggyecheon from the old days, the Hangang is, of course, an enormous river, central for the city. And if we go to visit it, it's very beautiful. I love going over in the subway at night. It's a very vital place, of course, for biking. I have biked there myself and my children many times, for picnicking, for just gathering together spontaneously with people in the city of Seoul. Of course, it's become very popular in the media and entertainment. Lots of dramas and movies are set there along whatever tragic moment in one's affair takes place there. And at the same time, of course, associated with the suicide, enormous high suicide rate in Seoul and other parts of the city. And these sort of like comments, this one, did you eat? Sort of like a comment aimed at people who might be considering suicide. And these places like Bampo Bridge, of course, became so well known for suicide that people actually went there for that purpose, and it became a sort of a tremendous problem, sort of social problem as well. So the river itself has a complex cultural significance. In terms of the markets, Seoul is above all a city of markets. They define it. Some examples, for example, with Gwangdong and Yangnyeong markets, the top one being very much traditional outdoor market with people selling, in some ways, the way they've done for the last 300 years. And Yangnyeong being more a traditional Oriental medicine, with a very, not so far from my school, traditional medicines and goods, a very, very interesting place. And in a way, traditional markets living on into the present. But there are other examples in Gwangjang, which was, of course, dates back to the beginning of the 20th century and the resistance against Japanese economic roads in Korea. And this is very much also a traditional market. Fabrics, the material for hanbok clothing, vintage clothing for young people, and of course various different food, including the mayak, or drug. It's supposed to be such great kimbap that you'll be addicted after one serving there, and still very much a part of the culture of Seoul. Some of the more interesting experiments with markets these days, say with the Dongjin traditional market up in the north, uses its own little money, right, that you can use only in that market. It has a variety of traditional restaurants, but they're mixed together with some rather modern-looking ones, and also some very creative and artistic ones. And this is one example of several here in which artists have sort of combined forces, the artists representing one part, with the traditional markets, the traditional people, the Ajima, who've been selling there for the last 50 years, to create a sort of a new and vital space. And that's very much a part of the Kangbuk style. Maybe a more striking example with the Dongjin traditional market, which includes, of course, some very ancient stores. But if you go inside of it, it combines a sort of avant-garde work by artists to create very modern, well, I say modern is maybe not the right word, but a very artistic environment, and it's combined with traditional stores in a truly unique way. I haven't really seen a market like that anywhere else. Another example is the Junyan market, near, also not that far from my house, in which a remarkable sort of combination of, on the first floor being traditional market, and then the basement area being lent out to various artists who are there creating sculpture, paintings, etc. And the two come together, as you can see in this case. Here's the Ajuma who's been serving, I think, kimbap for the last 40 years, and the artists have created this very interesting sort of painting of her to put above. And there are many also here as well, examples in which the artists who are there and they create these sort of drawings and paintings, etc., have sort of transformed the space of the market through their interactions. And this sort of combination I found particularly compelling. There's this market, a festival that they have thrown there at the market at Cheongshidan, bringing the two sort of groups together. Very, very sort of creative combination. They took the sort of smocks that people wear to sell fish, and they made them into sort of an artistic creation. And then if we go back to the Gangnam very much driven by the department stores, Hyundai, a department store, for example, Lotte, which are their own sort of communities, internalized, of course, much cleaner than it is out on the street, including galleries, culture centers, cafeterias, their own sort of like parks and internal cinemas, etc. And then DDP I just mentioned. DDP, the UFO that's set down in the middle of the city, is a really, really interesting space. I have been quite intrigued with it. It's a combination of an art museum, also a design center. It brings in large-scale projects like Hyundai Motors, for example. International companies come there to set up big events, in a way like COEX, but it's also combined with smaller efforts and efforts to cultivate sort of very small-scale design firms in Korea and give opportunities to them. And it's just an interesting space, very strangely shaped. As I understand, a lot of the Korean construction people working on it were very frustrated by the lack of right angles and the very sort of amorphous shape of the building overall. It has been much more, I mean, I think at the beginning people were very concerned about it, but it's become very, very popular. A lot of young people just go there to hang out, and they have their own sort of unique youth culture around DDP. And in this north, in Gangbuk, we also have enormous growth of mural art, a lot of places, Kung Fu being, of course, a webtoon artist, who's combined with the local community to create all these spaces with his art and work of others. So this is him as an artist. One of the new range of people in the webtoon. Korea has become a webtoon center only in the last 5-6 years. But Kyung was one of the people who has made ordinary people very much a part of his subject, right? Focusing on daily life in Seoul as part of his artistic expression. Some other examples, Iwa Village and Gamey Village, in which various different artists have combined forces to create a sort of new community and new sort of space within the city. Emphasizing, of course, the original, the traditional city of Seoul. This, of course, is not without its tensions. There are those in some of these cities who have been sort of put off by the attention that they've gotten, who haven't necessarily wanting to be gentrified, as we say, to be part of this effort. There are benefits that come with it, but of course sometimes undue attention. People put up signs saying that they don't want they want people to make all this noise. They don't want to become the subject of voyeurism in a sense, and also bringing attention to their own economic plight. Also, in the north, we have an enormous amount of effort to create gardens, sort of urban farming. Of course, cats everywhere. My neighborhood is full of cats. My son used to read the book series Warriors. I don't know if anyone read that. But he loved that there are so many cats around. And in the summer, you can hear all the cats crying from the different building tops and in the streets throughout the city. And then I mentioned Citizens Hall. This space, which is run by the Seoul Culture Foundation, is a remarkable sort of area in which there's both, the Fair Trade Cafe, where local merchants can sell their products. Part of the effort of the city to promote sort of this made in Seoul vision, that in the city of Seoul you can produce all sorts of goods, and Seoul will be sort of a complex economy within itself. And then there are all sorts of efforts, what I would associate with the Kyung approach, to creating jobs and a creative approach for young people, the Hajo Center, the Youth Hub, in which new efforts to allow young people to start their own businesses, to be creative, to create an alternative village for themselves. As part of the City Hall's efforts with sort of what they call village communities, the Mao Kungdongche effort to create small villages within parts of Seoul in which neighbors know each other and work together. Very much part of the sort of the Kanbu approach to the city. Made in Seoul. This is in my neighborhood, a small store which sells shoes, all made in the city of Seoul. And then Seoul Metro, one of the most creative spaces in the city. I've never seen a metro which has invested so much in sort of creative space. Anything from poems that are written in front of every door to artwork to special places like there's a sort of a zoo, Shindang, right, where you can pet reptiles and birds, and of course also efforts to sort of a social awareness. This is the sign within the Seoul Metro talking about how women should not have their bodies sort of codified or stereotyped by exterior commercial pressure. Or, for example, this one drawing attention to the crisis of food in the world, encouraging people not to waste food. Or this one encouraging people to save energy. Help for migrant workers. City of Seoul made all sorts of efforts, for example, with service where migrant workers could call and get explanation and assistance in their own language. Very, very creative effort to approach the issue. And then graffiti. I don't know if you're big graffiti fans, but Seoul, this is just a little pieces, has both stickers and graffiti all over, and some very, very interesting these are actually, I don't know if these are representative, but I found them interesting in the way that they're put together. Many spaces we find people trying to create their own sort of little creative spaces in the middle of the city. There's been an effort in the last 2 years to green the roofs of Seoul. Many places, if you go to tall buildings, you can see there are now sort of little park areas, and the city has supported that in, I think, a very innovative way. And then back to Gangnam, there's also the building constantly of these enormous apartment complexes, right? And there are big plans, particularly in Gyeonggi-gung, which was one of the Chosun palaces, for an enormous sort of very similar complexes. And there's this constant back and forth between those efforts in Hanbok style, I would say, for these small communities, and then this other effort to build these large style apartment buildings. As you know, apartment buildings like this, they're sort of designed and thought about in the same way you think about an automobile, right? They're units, they're developed. Often people buy them in advance before the building is finished construction, and they're very standardized. And the person buying it really puts very little effort at all into designing or creating it. Very different than the Hanbok style. On the other hand, I think Seongmi-san area, which is near Hapjeong, is very representative of another view of communities. It's a group that came together around 2003, first in protesting against the development of the mountain, Seongmi-san mountain, which they opposed, and the group came together and started to run their own alternative school from preschool all the way up now through high school. They created a cooperative, a village theater. They have all sorts of restaurants and activities. And the Seongmi-san community is a sort of a real village, which has emerged in the middle of an enormous city. And then on the other side, I'll just make a couple more remarks. We have the Lotte Republic, Lotte World Mall, which of course has been in the news very recently. Enormous space which has been developed, enormous department store like this. But in the middle of it, in fact, there are these enormous rising screens that have been built, but also this effort to sort of create a old-style Seoul, old-style sort of good for sale, as if you were in Gangbuk, in the middle of Gangnam. Even putting manholes in the floor to make you feel sort of more at home. And this example of like some of the neighborhoods which are now ghost towns, which have been cleared out for development. There have been enormous conflicts between the two cities over the issue of development. I'm sorry, I think I may have run out of time, and there's much more I'd like to tell you about the city of Seoul. I'm just starting this project, in fact, and I hope it was of interest to you. I think Seoul is a very, very dynamic city, and I've been fascinated by the interplay between these two cities, the sort of Gangbuk and Gangnam, and how, in a way, they stimulate each other, have created two very distinct but deeply linked cultures within the city of Seoul. Thank you very much.